It all began in Poland. What was impossible for many, Poland made possible.
In Poland, the Russians faced a fresh challenge. The new Pope, Karol Wojtyła, visited his homeland. He called on his flock to recapture control of their destiny.
It broke down the barrier of fear. We saw that if we could stick together in solidarity, the authorities would have less power.
The Polish economy was in crisis. There were shortages everywhere. Western loans had been squandered and the country was burdened by foreign debt. When the government yet again raised food prices in the summer of 1980, workers at the Gdansk shipyard staged an illegal strike. The strikers drew up a 21-point list of demands and refused to leave the shipyard until they were met.
This fight with the communist monster was really impossible. We could only fight against it by using its own weapons, because it pretended to be the people's system. The only effective way was for us to organize around bread and butter issues and use these concerns to gain our freedom. We set about using truth to conquer untruth.
The government decided to negotiate with the strikers, but first it promised there would be no reprisals.
Jak jest możliwe, żeby ktoś traktował działaczy tutaj zebranych?
Panie premierze, kiedy ja mam dziesiątki straszenia mnie już, że jak tylko wyjdę, to będzie to i to. Ja nie tylko...
Proszę pana, to i mnie wtedy trzeba przepędzić.
Nie możemy ulegać emocji.
Nie ma takiej intencji.
What began as an economic protest became a demand for sweeping political concessions. The government negotiators gave way to the workers' key demands.
Mamy wreszcie niezależne, samorządne związki zawodowe. Mamy prawo do strajku.
The workers were joined by intellectuals. Together they formed a new movement, Solidarity. Support spread throughout Poland.
For the first time, they had a taste of being citizens, with civil liberties, which you don't forget. For someone who had lived under communism, it was like a narcotic or fresh air. It was like having your identity for the first time.
Solidarity was given massive coverage in the Western media. The United States provided crucial covert assistance.
We tried to meet their specific requests, what they asked us for, and those requirements were conveyed to us through a variety of channels. They wanted communications equipment of various kinds, offset printing presses, radio equipment, things of that sort.
Solidarity became increasingly defiant. As the movement began to challenge the communist system, Moscow watched with growing alarm.
По всем линиям шло давление на польское руководство.
We exerted pressure on the Polish leadership all the time to take more decisive measures to restore order.
By December 1980, Soviet pressure on the Polish leadership was intense. Warsaw Pact forces were massed around Poland's borders. The message was obvious: curb solidarity, or there is worse to come. American concern grew.
The critical moment came in December of 1980, when the Soviets were poised to intervene in Poland. We did everything we could to mobilize international opinion, to galvanize maximum international pressure on the Soviets, to convince the Soviets that we will not be passive.
Наше руководство и мы.
Our leadership, including we the military, thought that under no circumstances should we move in the troops. We said one Afghanistan is enough. We will have to make the Polish comrades solve the problem with their own forces.
The Kremlin, bent on ending Solidarity's mutiny, leaned forcefully on the Polish leader, General Jaruzelski. Soviet actions were influencing America's 1980 presidential elections. Carter faced difficult odds. The economy was slack. Americans were still hostage in Iran. The Russians were still in Afghanistan.
There was what he himself called a growing spirit of malaise in the United States. And that malaise related, I believe, to popular sense of the decline of American strength and of Western strength, and also of American clarity and purpose in the world.
Carter's opponent was the Republican, Ronald Reagan.
Thanks very much. Now, if the boat doesn't go straight, it's because they tell me I got to steer for it.
We have got to stop letting all of these events catch us by surprise, as Carter has been caught by surprise. We have got to control events to the place that we don't run into a crisis that inevitably leads to war.
Reagan won the election by a large margin. He had promised much tougher policies against Moscow.
It was necessary to show that détente couldn't work in order to go beyond it and to re-engage in the Cold War, to re-establish a set of objectives that was aimed at victory in the Cold War rather than ending it by accommodation.
America's hardline policy boosted morale in Poland. Solidarity now had 9 million members supporting their fight for economic reform and political rights. Strikes gripped the country. The Soviets were tightening the screws on the Poles. Brezhnev pressed Jaruzelski to plan countermeasures.
Ja otrzymałem posłanie od Breżniewa. To posłanie miało charakter.
I received a letter from Brezhnev.
Niedopuszczający
This letter had the character of an ultimatum, warning Poland not to change its structure and policies. If we made any changes, we should expect military intervention.
Interwencja ze wszystkimi jej skutkami.
On December 2nd, 1981, a fireman's strike was crushed by riot police. It was a warning to Solidarity that the authorities were ready to use force. On December 12th, Solidarity met to plan a nationwide strike. That night, the Polish government sent in the army. Solidarity's leaders were arrested. Solidarity was banned. President Jaruzelski declared martial law.
Obywatelki i obywatele, wielki jest ciężar odpowiedzialności, jaka spada na mnie w tym dramatycznym momencie polskiej historii. Obowiązkiem moim jest wziąć tę odpowiedzialność. Chodzi o przyszłość Polski.
Martial law fractured East-West relations. Civil rights were suspended, mocking the Helsinki Declaration. Moscow had reimposed its will.
In 1981, I said to the gentleman who came to arrest me, "This is the moment of your defeat. These are the last nails in the coffin of communism."
The fires of rebellion burned on.
Many consider the military buildup under Reagan to be the decisive factor in the end of the Cold War, forcing the Soviets into an escalation of the arms race they couldn't afford.
It is often said that Reagan intentionally drove the Soviets to spend themselves into their own grave, but the problem with that is that it completely ignores internal developments in the Soviet Union and the bloc. To say Reagan, or the United States for that matter, won the Cold War is to pretend that the Soviet Union didn't have its own historical dynamic, and of course it did.
In the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was ruled by aging hardliners. Their economic policies drained the economy, while their repressive political policies stifled dissent. The rise of Mikhail Gorbachev to power in 1985 brought new direction to the Soviet Union. Gorbachev recognized that in order to revitalize the Soviet Union, he had to initiate significant reform, both at home and abroad.
Gorbachev was trying to preserve communism. He felt that their economy had failed, and therefore he was going to have what he called perestroika, or restructuring. And then it turned out the bureaucrats resisted that. And so he launched the idea of glasnost, or open discussion, as a way of lighting fire under the bureaucrats. But once you opened discussion and you asked people, do you want to be part of this system? They voted with their feet. The answer was no. They wanted out. And that essentially meant it was more and more difficult to control the system.